And so my message this morning is about the power of the tongue. And I guess we all probably know stories of how persuasive words have changed the world. Think of those kind of iconic speeches that we know about, like Martin Luther King and his I Have a Dream speech. Somehow just painted this vision of a society that is just and fair and where no one is prejudiced against, and that speech kind of inspired a whole vision, a faith, a desire to see a society that matched that dream. Think of Winston Churchill and some of his powerful speeches. I love to watch him and to see him kind of in action. And JFK once said of Winston Churchill that he mobilized the English language and sent it into battle. That was Winston Churchill's gift. He had this amazing way with words, and that speech that he spoke in the House of Commons, I think it was, where he said, we'll fight them on the beaches, we'll fight them here, we'll fight them there, we'll fight them everywhere. He even committed Mauritius to fight, because he said in the end, even if England falls, all of the outlying kind of districts, the rest of the empire, they'll rise up and fight against the Germans. So you didn't know it, but you were committed to fight in the Second World War by Winston Churchill in his famous speech. So obviously many examples in the Bible, but one that springs to mind is in Acts chapter 19. It's one of the major leading cities of the time in Asia. It's Ephesus, and during the period of one day, 2 speeches changed that city. One spurred it into a riot, and the other one sent everyone home in peace. The situation unfolds because the gospel is being preached. People are hearing the message about Jesus. And because people are hearing the message about Jesus, they are leaving their idols, the things that they used to worship, the sticks and the statues and the silver articles and things that they used to worship. They're leaving those to worship Jesus. And one of the silversmiths at the time, his name was Demetrius, he was very unhappy that his business was being affected by this message of Jesus. He gathers the craftsmen together and he says a speech. You guys know our livelihoods are going to be affected if this carries on like it is. And he stirred up a riot. Before long, the whole city was in riot. The mass crowds approached the amphitheater. They were shouting at the top of their voices, this crowd. And eventually, some Christian gets up and he's kind of the target of their opposition. And they start to shout, "Great is Artemis of the Ephesians," for 2 hours. One crowd inspired by one man's speech. And after all of that comes to an end, the town clerk gets up. And he just has this amazing, we don't even know who he was, what he believed, or kind of what it was that caused him to have this kind of effect on the crowd. But he quietened the crowd. He spoke to them rationally. He said, what on earth is going on here? The courts are open. If anyone has a complaint, they can take someone to court. There's no reason for us to be in riot. If someone had to accuse us of rioting, we'd have no defense for our actions here today. And he dismissed the crowd and sent them home. One man raises a whole city into riot. Another man brings peace and sends everyone home. It's the power of the tongue. Well, the tongue is also like a spark, because with a few words you can set ablaze something in your life. That's what happened in Ephesus, and of course there are many, many examples of how people have done things like that. There's one in the Bible that comes to mind. It's a man named Nabal. And he was a kind of landowner, wealthy, sheep, cattle, whatever he had. And at the time where he was living, David and his kind of partners, his team, they were on the run for their lives. David was the future king of Israel, very powerful man, strong in battle, courageous guy. Wherever David and his men went, they would make sure that things were fine. They'd protect the shepherds, no sheep would get stolen, everything was fine wherever David was. And Nabal had benefited from David's men being in his vicinity. Time came for the kind of shearing of sheep and parties and things, and David sent word, hey Nabal, we've kind of looked after you, have you got anything for us? And Nabal said, well, who's David? I mean, these guys all wandering around, all these people wandering around all over the place. Who's David and why should I give anything to him? Carried on with his party. But those little words of Nabal's got back to David's ear, and David and his people mustered for war. Started a fire. Nabal wasn't even aware. Spoke a spark, landed over the hill, and suddenly there's a bushfire and it's coming straight for him. He's got no idea about it. Spoken a few careless words. Fortunately, Nabal's wife intervened and kind of made sure that David and his men were supplied, but Nabal still lost his life because when it became aware of what happened, he got a heart attack, basically. The Bible says his heart failed, and it took about 10 days and then he died. And all of that happened because of a few careless words that started a fire in his life. Thank you very much, Apostle James. This is what you've said to us so far. The tongue can change the direction of your life. The tongue can set your life on fire. The tongue cannot be controlled. Where on earth do we go from here? And where he takes us is to the heart. Because the tongue speaks of what's in the heart. It's actually the same thing that Jesus said. Jesus said in Matthew 15, the things that come out of a person's mouth come from the heart. And that's what defiles them. For out of the heart come evil thoughts, murder, adultery, sexual immorality, theft, false testimony, and slander. The things that pass across our lips are things that first are harbored in the heart. We know it's true because you can think 1,000 thoughts before one of them lands on your tongue. You have that internal world. It's kind of happening, it's happening, it's happening, and eventually it escapes via the tongue. But it's not the tongue that's at fault. It's not that you couldn't control the tongue in the moment, it's that your heart was full of all these things and eventually it came out of your mouth. There's no problem, no point even, really, in trying to tame the tongue when the tongue isn't the issue. The issue is what's happening in your and my hearts. It's a story in the Old Testament of King David, again, that same one I referred to just now. He's been driven out of Jerusalem by his own son. His own son has risen up in a rebellion, taking over the kingdom, and David is running for his life again, the poor guy. Taking his family, taking his citizens. And as they go, there's someone throwing stones at him. Someone walking along the mountain ridge as they walk along the road, picking up stones and hurling them at him. Hating David for all his history and what he's done. This guy is a Benjamite, he's from Saul's line, and he just despises the fact that David even came into power in the first place, throwing stones. Eventually David's bodyguard says to him, listen, can I cut that guy's head off? Please let me cut that guy's head off. It's making me angry. And David says to him, what has this got to do with you? Maybe God is using him to point out things in my life. What has this got to do with you? Either what springs out of your heart is anger, revenge, violence, or grace and forgiveness and peace. It's got to do with what's in the heart. It's not got to do with what your tongue is waiting to say. From a hardened sinner to a tender repenter. It's that jolly David again. He committed adultery with Bathsheba. We know the story. Everyone probably knows the story. Had her husband killed. Terrible, terrible thing. And then he covers it up. Carries on like nothing happened. Marries the girl. Everything fine. It's just like, don't have to worry about it. I've taken care of it. Everything's fine. His heart is as hard as it can possibly be. No tenderness there. It's hidden. It's under covers. I've sorted it out. And then the prophet Nathan comes and says, hey, David, let me tell you a story. Tells him a story. It's a different story, but it's the same principle. Gets to the end of the story and David is like, that guy should die. That guy that did that should die. How hard a heart can you be? When the prophet is speaking about you and you're saying that person should die. And the prophet says, it's you, David. It's you. And what does David say? I've sinned against the Lord. I've sinned. I'm so sorry. It is me, I did it. It is me, I did it. You can have the hardest heart. You can speak as though you're innocent. You can defend yourself to human beings and to God himself. Pretend that nothing happened and don't let anyone into your space. But if God is working and your heart is changing and you get to the place of, I'm sorry, it's me.